Okay, fantastic. Well, it's so great to see everyone here tonight. Good evening, and thank you for joining. And welcome to the first of 5 sessions of Projecting Fellows, which will run weekly on Tuesday nights through February 2nd. We are Katie MacDonald and Kyle Schumann, and we'll begin the session tonight with a brief introduction before handing it off to this evening's moderators. Additional information on the series, participants, and upcoming events can be found at projectingfellows.com. We want to start by saying we're grateful to the University of Virginia School of Architecture for virtually hosting these events, Dean Isla Berman and Chair of Architecture Felipe Correa for their support of the series and bringing us to UVA, Sneha Patel and Darcy Engel for their assistance in preparing and promoting the series, UTK Graphic Design Fellow Chris Coate for art direction and graphic design, Wei Hao Wing for website design and development, and Jason Young, Director of the University of Tennessee School of Architecture, for taking a chance on us as co-fellows.
Each year, several architecture schools nationwide name fellows to join their programs and develop an intensive research or teaching project during a short-term appointment. With the fellowship comes some combination of project support, cross-pollination between research and teaching, and a platform with which to present and exhibit the work. Commonly selected via national call for proposals, fellowship projects are duly indicative of emerging interests in academia and evolving institutional agendas. Projecting Fellows brings together the 2019 to 2020 class of fellows from American architecture schools to explore a cross-section of emerging interests in the discipline and the vehicle of the fellowship project, which is understood here as a kind of institutional investment on the part of universities in a new generation of scholars. While each school supports the development and dissemination of fellowship work, no comprehensive venue for dialogue between fellows has taken shape. This series aims to elucidate the fellowship in its various formats and provide insight into how fellowships are conducted, the critical role of teaching in these appointments, and the other types of opportunities afforded. Through the convergence of fellows, the meta project of the Architectural Fellowship is uncovered. Its role, its curation, and its consequences in shaping the discipline.
The series was conceived for 3 audiences. First, the fellows themselves, who often enjoy considerable support and the great gift of time to develop their teaching and research, but also uproot themselves, relocating for finite appointments. We hope this venue might provide a larger collectivity between those on the precipice of their academic careers. Second, for an emerging generation of aspiring scholars and architects who may gain some insight into the often opaque fellowship system as an incubator for teaching and research, and a possible route into scholarly careers or the launching of an architectural practice. Third, the broader architecture community by bringing together scholars and designers to discuss new ideas and imperatives for architectural discourse, a kind of projection of where the discipline is headed. The paradigm shifts of 2020 make such dialogue across geographic and institutional boundaries more critical than ever.
Each evening in the series will feature short presentations by a series of fellows, followed by a discussion led by a pair of moderators. Some fellowships have been completed while others are still in progress, resulting in a range of completion and rawness in the work to be shared. Tonight's session is themed Digital Imaginary, and we would like to introduce our distinguished moderators. Maya Alam is co-founder of Alam Profit of Practice, a studio which combines everyday digital habits, contemporary imaging technologies, and traditional craftsmanship. Alam was the inaugural recipient of the 2016 to 2017 Boghosian Fellowship at Syracuse University. She has taught at SciArc, Yale University, and is currently on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. She holds a diploma in engineering of interior architecture from the Peter Behrens School of Architecture in Dusseldorf and a Master of Architecture with distinction from SciArc, where she was awarded the AIA Henry Adams certificate and a selected Best Thesis Award. Donna Kupkova is Associate Professor and Track Chair of the Masters in Sustainable Design program at Carnegie Mellon University and is a co-founder and director of Epiphyte Lab, a practice recognized as Next Progressives by Architect Magazine. Kupkova's design work engages the built environment at the intersection of ecology, computationally driven processes, and systems analysis. Kupkova received the professional degree of engineer architect from the Slovak University of Technology in Bratislava. She completed her thesis at the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna, and holds a Master of Architecture from UCLA, where she was awarded the Unrestricted University Fellowship, the Mimi Perloff Award, and the Kate Neal Kinley Memorial Fellowship. Maya and Donna, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We'll hand it off to you now to guide us through the presentations and discussion.
Great. Yeah, we haven't discussed who starts talking, only who starts introducing. Yeah, Donna, I think you said you're going to start introducing. I just wanted to say thank you, Katie and Kyle, for having me for this wonderful event and getting us all together in times of separation. It's always good to have conversations with colleagues and friends.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you, Katie and Kyle. Really great to be here. Thanks for having us. I didn't realize I was a fellow too, so that's good to know. So we're going to kick off the series of presentations. We have a digital imaginary with Viola Ago. Each of us, we're going to go back and forth, introduce each of the presenters, and which is going to follow by 10-minute presentations. And then we're going to start more of a collective dialogue about the work after the fact. So hope we can stick with us at the end and join us in the discussion.
I'm gonna keep my introduction to our next speaker, Galo Canizares. Sorry, I was just last minute thinking, I should have checked with you, Galo, how to pronounce your name. I'm sure that was, okay, good, thumbs up. I'm gonna keep it relatively short. I just wanna say before I start, Galo, I'm super excited to see your presentation, and your book from 2019. Is that 2019 on our stack to read? We'll get to that. So I'm really excited to introduce Galo Canizares, who was the 2018-20 Yessios visiting assistant professor at the Ohio State University, where he previously held the 2016-17 Howard E. Lefevre Emerging Practitioner Fellowship and is co-director of Office CA. Canizares is currently lecturer at Texas Tech and visiting professor at Virginia Tech. And Galo holds a Bachelor of Environmental Design from the University of Colorado and a Master of Architecture from MIT. And I'll give you the floor/screen, Galo.
Thanks. Share my screen here. All right, how's that? Good? Awesome. Thanks a lot, Maya, and thank you, Katie and Kyle, for hosting. I echo the thanks to UVA and all of the people involved in hosting this platform and creating this opportunity for this discussion. So I want to start with a kind of fact sheet about my particular fellowship for two reasons, really. One, I suspect that maybe a lot of you in the audience, or a few of you at least, are applying for jobs or applying for these kinds of fellowships. And so this hopes to shed some light on how some of these things work. And second, I also wanted to maybe call out some of the more opaque aspects of these types of positions. I mean, one thing that's actually really nice about the fellowship that I had at Ohio State is that Ohio State and generally public institutions are required to disclose a lot of this kind of nitty-gritty stuff, right? So, you know, the OSU is required to disclose salaries and budgets, and I think that's always a factor, especially, you know, for young practitioners that are often asked to uproot their entire life to pursue this you know, opportunity. And so I think that transparency is pretty important. But this fact sheet is also a little bit misleading as well, because the fellowship that I will talk about no longer exists. So it's kind of unfortunate. It was a kind of one-off thing, and Ohio State is actually reimagining the Yessios position at the moment. But nevertheless, I do think that this kind of data it can serve as a kind of context for the work that was produced. So, for instance, the teaching load at Ohio State is quite low. I think in comparison to other fellowships, I was only required to teach 1 studio per semester, no seminars, no other classes. And so that in turn allowed me a lot of time and allows fellows actually a lot of time for independent research and work. I will also say that personally, I had a leg up during the application process. I had already been teaching at Ohio State, and like Maya said, I was a previous fellow there. And so the search committee was already familiar with my pedagogy and my work. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that that kind of privilege that is often a factor in these kinds of processes. Okay, so the fellowship is a 2-year fellowship, and the first year of my fellowship was basically focused on getting this book done that Maya also kind of alluded to, Digital Fabrications, Designer Stories for a Software-Based Planet. So I put together a book proposal in the summer of 2018, and I was shopping it around to different publishers, and it was sort of widely rejected because it was kind of bizarre. It's like kind of a collection of short stories. Luckily, Ohio State had an existing relationship with the publisher Applied Research and Design because they published their source books. And so I was put in contact with Jake Anderson over there. And he liked my proposal, and we started to negotiate a contract. And so the first semester of the fellowship was actually spent sort of figuring out how to actually publish a book. And I was able to hire a graphic designer, and we got the ball rolling there. All in all, the first year of the fellowship really was 100% sort of committed to this book and teaching, 1 studio per semester. The proposal that I was sending out to publishers was essentially the proposal that I had sent to the fellowship committee. And it revolved around this idea that software has engendered a kind of new consciousness that affects not only how we act socially, but also how we act as designers, or how we work as designers. And so because software impacts labor, politics, imagination, social interactions, et cetera, we as designers need new frames of reference, we need new histories, and essentially new ways of relating to software in general, right? And I think it's actually really convenient that Viola went right before me, because we had talked previously about how I think our work sort of complements each other in really interesting ways. And this might be also one of the ways, the way that we look at software, essentially. And so the way that this thesis is engaged in the book is primarily through critical essays, but also through fictional short stories and projects. There's also a foreword by Ellie Abrams from Michigan, which in my opinion makes the entire book kind of worth it. But the fellowship was like the Wortham. It was a kind of 2-position fellowship, and in 2018, Viola was my Yessios counterpart. In 2019, Zach Cohen was my sort of counterpart, and so in a way, there was a kind of expectation that the Yessios fellows collaborate and put on big public programming events that went sort of beyond the traditional lecture that's usually associated with fellowships. So in 2018, this public programming took the form of public workshops that were based on our individual research. So for me, that meant taking this idea that software is a political site, and that privatized software often, in a way, kind of holds us hostage, and creating a kind of workshop that focused on learning code as a way of liberating oneself from these proprietary tools. So this workshop in 2018 introduced students to open source and browser-based 3D interaction, primarily using the programming language JavaScript. And they made these kind of quirky little 3D interactive interfaces. And you can see here in the middle image here, that's Chris Yessios, the sponsor of the fellowship during the workshop reviews. In keeping with the same theme, the following semester, we invited different artists and designers to teach these workshops. This is one workshop that was led by the artist Theo Triantafylidis from LA. He taught a Unity workshop. introducing our students to sort of game environments. And again, the emphasis was not really just about learning new modes of representation, but also about reflecting on how these freely available tools like Unity can make architecture and design more accessible and perhaps even more equitable. Fast forward to the following year, here in 2019, the Yessios public programming became a little bit more reflective in a sense, meaning that we started to look inwardly at what we were doing. So Zach Cohen and I organized a symposium on digital fabrication called Homing the Machine. Here, it was a kind of crazy lineup of designers, critics, and practitioners. Here you see Skylar Tibbetts, Molly Wright-Steenson, Marshall Prado, and Maria Yablonina. And we were discussing basically the current state of digital fabrication. We were discussing its limits, its potentials, its modes of exclusion, bias, ethics, and it was really a kind of incredible set of conversations. And to me, it was really the conversation that was the most productive part. Right. So because in contrast to conferences like Acadia, for instance, which some of you might be affiliated with, Homing the Machine really prompted individuals to talk openly about non-technological things that inform their digital fabrication work. So for example, things like relationship to culture, to the clients, to other disciplines, to even sort of things like morals and ethics. And so within that, like taking those kind of questions, we had open, just frank conversations about, why they're practicing the way that they do. And it was actually really, really exciting. And we're still trying to figure out what to do with the documentation from this. I don't know, maybe it'll turn into a book or something. And lastly, the last component of the Yessios Fellowship was a gallery show. And so this is, sorry. Here. So this is footage from the gallery show, Assorted Demo Scenes, which was basically the kind of culminating documentation of the 2-year fellowship in my case. And conceptually, the show was a way of relating all of this fellowship work back to what we might call the material condition of the digital. So for example, if the main point of my fellowship was to research the underlying politics and the psychosocial effects of softwareization. It's basically a term that Levmanovich uses to describe the fact that we just work through software primarily. Then this exhibition really was an attempt to materialize those points. So it built off of the book, it built off of the workshops and my teaching, and sort of pragmatically, it was basically just a collection of gadgets that were built out of mostly open source and freely available software and cheap hardware. So that's why it has this kind of raw look to it. And there's a lot of different ways that we could talk about this show and each individual component. But I'll just share some pictures just in the interest of time. There was things like an exploration of materiality of screens, an exploration of digital color. There was a sort of an inquiry into the aesthetics of the DIY movement. There was a reference to real-time simulations. There was ideas about open source robotics and 3D printing. But what it really came down to was a desire to kind of expand the way that we think about digital media and architecture, right? So beyond the tools of productivity, beyond disciplinary conventions, and also beyond the kind of dystopian sci-fi of like artificial intelligence and the kitschy, outdated versions of the future that you see in things like Cyberpunk or Ready Player One. How else can we imagine architecture's relationship to the digital? And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Galo. I'll give it back to Dana.
Thank you, Galo. So next, I'd like to introduce Michael Jefferson. Michael, welcome. Michael is in 2019, or actually was 2019, 2020 is over, thank God. Innovation in Design Fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He's also co-principal of GLE with Susan Lettieri. And currently, Michael teaches at the Cooper Union and is concurrently an assistant teaching professor of architecture at Pennsylvania State University. Michael Jefferson holds Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Film Studies from Indiana University and Master of Architecture from Cornell University. Welcome, Michael, and the screen is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Donna. Let me go ahead and get this set up here. Let's see. Is that all good? Except for the full screen.
Good.
Okay, great. So the fellowship at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee was a year-long fellowship that I held, obviously last year. And of course, I want to thank the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee for the generous support in hiring me as a fellow and supporting the research, and the students there for supporting the work. And also thank you to Katie and Kyle for asking me to join this and for supporting the symposium, putting it all together, and the University of Virginia for hosting this. The University of Wisconsin Innovation Design Fellowship is sort of like a package between many different types of fellowships, meaning like a teaching fellowship, which is focused mostly on the work that's done in studios with no deliverable output, and also a design research fellowship. So in that sense, the expectations are dual: to teach 2 courses, an option studio and an elective course, as well as one additional studio, and then to produce some sort of design output at the end, or writing output. In my case, it was a design installation, which ended up wrapping up in October due to the pandemic. So it's a really great opportunity in that case to sort of marry the two together. So I think in a lot of cases, the design output is either distinguished and sort of separate from the teaching, or the teaching is the work predominantly and the research happens separately. In this case, really both things happen at once, and it was kind of a terrific opportunity. With that said, what I'm going to present here is really an encapsulated, bracketed view of that fellowship. So it's really that project and the work that was produced through the design research and the output itself, and less maybe discussion about the fellowship process and more focused on that project. So the work of the fellowship really was focused on attempting to locate specific moments of friction where disciplinary conventions come into contact with and modified by emerging technologies. And in this fellowship, predominantly that was through using machine learning as a kind of foil. The proposition via the design installation was to fold the tendencies that are discovered in the machine back onto those kind of disciplinary conventions, in this case, typology, and into ways that we think about making architecture, back into the processes of making it, the pedagogies we develop, and kind of format a reciprocal relationship or discursive relationship with technology. So this was kind of developed through an idea of looking at the conventional ways that we sort knowledge and thereby understand the world traditionally, which in this case, I'm kind of proposing that's through taxonomic systems. So these include the routine organizing of files into digital folders that are native to our operating systems, but are also tied up in Linnaean hierarchical systems of biological classification, and carries over into the ways that architects such as Blondel, Buffon, and Leroy invoke typology to categorize architecture. Together, these serve as kind of ubiquitous ways in which we bracket, categorize, and domesticate the world. In Philippe Scher's diary, however, we're presented with a dizzyingly vast array of images that serve as an archive of the designer's life over a period of 7 years. Here, the images resist traditional methods of organization and suggest the imbrication of software with epistemological frameworks. In this case, that images are tagged and researchable and are allowed to be retrieved without any sort of form of sorting. This initiates an approach to the organization of information that radically redeploys our engagement with the computer and dismantles the obligation to organize information taxonomically, and perhaps suggests a new framework for working typologically. So in our discipline, one way in which we conventionally classify buildings is through analytical sequences of abstraction, such as superimposing like types to determine their similarities while eliminating differences, arriving at basic root forms or deep structures. In convolutional neural networks, however, they are packed with complex arrangements of algorithms that perform black box tasks. Sequences of abstraction are not only hidden from the user, but locate patterns in visual data that are undetectable to humans or by conventional architectural analyses. So if abstraction of buildings yields a singular root form for identifying type, the approach to classification in machine learning occurs instead through a granular accrual. In the case of these digits here, the machine conducts its classification by breaking down the visual data into hyper-specific traits. The series of fragments form lines and loops, and these lines and loops are classified as assemblages later on in the network. So for instance, here, the line in a loop yields a 9, and this accruement of traits then begins to construct a classification of overall figures. The machine then finds hidden patterns through recursive applications of low-level image processing operations. So for instance, think about like basic Photoshop contrast filters applied again and again and recursively. Each resultant output is performed with other image processes, with each layer decreasing the resolution of the image. So in this case, the digits started out as 28 by 28 pixel blocks, and then ultimately are reduced down to 4 by 4 groups of pixels. This teases out particularities of each digit that elicit features only observable by the machine. And this ultimately arrives at a set of images that are abstracted into blocks of pixels that together speak to the particular traits of a particular digit. So on one hand, we have Duran's basic diagrams, which abstract architecture into its most basic geometric arrangements. And on the other, we have the machine with specific traits that make a type. For instance, in this case, what makes a 2 a 2. These methods of classifying knowledge are inverted as generative diagrams in Duran's case. These internal diagrams can be employed toward the infinite variation of types, as exhibited in this image. But the machine doesn't really operate or care about basic diagrams or deep structures. Instead, it replicates and assembles patterns of features to generate novel reproductions. Here, a series of Pokemon, they're machine generated. So while these images look like Pokemon in their shapes and colors, we can see that their parts are rearranged. Some have no eyes, some are all tails and legs without heads or torsos. And we can hold two competing ideas in our heads about these images. They're both Pokemon and they're not. So in other words, they are all feature and no structure, and sets up a kind of discursive relationship between deep structures and deep fakes. The design project, the design installation, capitalizes on this research as an exhibition of fake walls that are built with real materials. So tied up between the computational logics of artificial intelligence and the conventional tectonic arrangements of stud framing, the protocols of the machine and machine learning are mapped onto traditional methods of construction. One part exhaustive and one part translative, the project features the production of over 2,000 typical walls, one machine learning model, infinite artificial walls, and 4 physical false walls. Instead of working with buildings or working with typology as a medium, this project introduces standard 2x4 wood frame wall assemblages as conventional tectonic systems and folds the behaviors in the machine back into the process. The standard material arrangements are kept in the formation of a variety of these over 2,000 walls. These include a series of typical rules of assemblage and parts of 2x4 frame walls endemic to this kind of stud framing, such as 16-inch on-center studs, sill plates, sole plates, double top plates, king studs, trimmer studs, cripple studs, and headers. Oops, let me back up here. Within that kind of categorization, there are corresponding families of different colors. So each category is a different type with different new rules that are accompanying it, including different varieties and arrangements of gypsum board, different numbers of openings, different types of openings, whether they're windows and walls. This is each affiliated with each color blocking for each type. The machine learning model was then fed this data set of images and trained, yielding a model capable of generating an infinite variety of new fake walls. The interface serves as a mediating environment that spatializes the results in a choose-your-own adventure of typological experience. On one hand, the infinite grid works within traditional methods of comparison, in which walls are infinitely registered, situated, and compared against one another. And on the other hand, difference occurs across and through the experience of scrolling, manifested as a digital space being navigated here. The corresponding digital model is interpreting and literalizing the machine learning software as a developed surface drawing, which then thus endlessly produces images, which are then sponsoring an endless offsetting of rooms within rooms within rooms, the corresponding spatial experience to the infinite scroll. The physical installation is locating the first room within this kind of infinite offsetting as a site that is accompanied by the design of 4 walls. Instead of selecting a set of walls from the infinitely generating model, the project asks, what are the behaviors and rules of the machine that dictate this endless production? How might those behaviors be fed into the rule set for designing new fake walls with real materials and real tectonic requirements and constraints? As with the variety of Pokemon species, the machine has learned particular and repeatable features of the walls. Contained within the model here are all of the traits of the original images available to be expressed at will. Learning the behaviors of how these traits are superimposed and brought together becomes a form of close reading and critical analysis. These tendencies, such as a predilection for curvature, generated by the averaging, generated by the averaging of images together, are manifested as modifications to the original data set and tectonic conventions, modifications to those original stud framing rules. The use of color as notation is also mixed up here. A psychedelic array is often present in a single wall, suggesting a hybridization and transferring of traits between wall images. The walls produced in the installation are both real and not. In building the thing itself, the machine learning model is inverted. Whereas the machine-generated images are fake versions of existing walls, the machine doubles down by making real versions of fake images, incorporating the behaviors of the machine into materiality. Doing so encourages a dialectic between rules of the machine, material tectonics, and design methodology. The conflation of the rules and their working back and forth intertwines the walls so that they're impossibly mediated by both the digital and the physical. The result sponsors new effects that suggest a legible ambiguity. There are no blurs or gradients in the final physical construction, but the reading of parts and materials are at times discrete and at other times ambiguously difficult to discern from one another. Alignments and misalignments between its representation and its materiality produce a hierarchical confusion. The rules of the digital and the physical here then displace one another to rearrange tectonic and conceptual motivations. Novel modifications to conventions of assembly are introduced, and a new form of typology is suggested that implicates both the conceptual underpinnings of deep structures and the indexing of granular features of deepfakes. And that's it. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Baya?
Great. So next we have Zahra Safaverdi. Again, I probably should have checked with you, Zahra, how to pronounce your last name. I apologize if I didn't do a very good job. But Zahra was the 2019 and 2020 Schidlowski Emerging Faculty Fellow at Kent State University, where she continues to teach and is founder of The Living Room and the director of Masks. Safaverdi previously held the Irving Innovation Fellowship in Architecture at Harvard University. She holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and a Master of Architecture from Harvard University. And Zahra, the screen is yours.
All right. Can everybody see my screen? All right. Well, thank you, Maya, for the introduction, and thank you, Kyle and Katie, for the invitation, and University of Virginia for holding. I was holding the Schidlowski position in 2019-2020. I think unlike Galo's position, that fellowship is very teaching heavy. and there is research obligations, and there's an expectation of the output of the research in form of a public lecture or installation. I taught 2 studios in the fall semester, foundation studio and an option studio, and a seminar and another studio in the spring semester. The heavy teaching load and a research combined created a tunnel vision and a rather hermetically sealed environment. It was me in the building. So I feel it would be pretty appropriate if I keep everything within the building. The focus of my 10 minutes presentation is going to be on the output, which was a exhibition that was a series of 3 installations that also encompassed some of the teachings. Before getting there, given the very discursive and theoretical heavy nature of the work, I think it is appropriate to talk a little bit about the background of the final output. How could pictorial realm become a mode of discovery of latent rationalities and connecting incompatible words instead of merely illustrating the real? This is the main question I was trying to answer with a disciplinary proposal at the beginning of my research. Given the heavily discursive nature of the work, the research has been extensive, perhaps to be unpacked on another occasion. However, I feel it's appropriate to briefly go over the index of the main discursive work I was reading during the search and research, given that it heavily impacted my teaching, especially during fall semester, and the techniques that was developed during spring semester for the seminar as well. People also who their various essays played an instrumental role in translating the literature to disciplinary work, Erko Naginski and Giuliano Bruno in particular, and architecture that is not merely a fantastical freewill or something fully out of my imagination. Also, I'd like to briefly point out the main precedents from artists Isaac Julian and Julie Morato that I was looking at, in addition to the golden age of theater in 15th century Spain. All of the work heavily inspired the usage of layering, which we're going to see in a minute, and the residual qualities of tracing and the implications of it, an implication of making something that has been fully flattened, rather delaminated. The exhibition at large encompasses 3 separate spaces. There is Armstrong Gallery, there's the annex, and there's a latent compatibility room set in the material library. To cover each space adequately, enough for the time being, I will use the lobby of John Eliot Center for Architecture and the main hallway as a rhetorical apparatus, which will allow us to step in and out of each given space. With Kundin Garden, literature has been used as a proxy for architecture to discover its latent spatial potential. Voltaire's Candide greatly resonates with us, from its satirical stance toward inequality in the world to criticizing dogma and advocating freedom of speech to being a canonical representation of the work of the Enlightenment era. By close reading of motifs represented in the book, with a focus on gardens and the metaphor of journey from one part of the world to another, representation of Candide have been taken many steps further from being merely illustrations. With a focused methodology, established modes of projection have been followed to invent new ways of spatial representation based on existing transformational operation. Doing so shifts the focus from representation itself to the representation of meaning, and shift the representation of the meaning to the condition of representation and its actual material implication. By portraying paradise, or rather disciplining paradisical spaces, Candide's Garden sets up a collective drift in a journey from Eden to paradise to what is asymptotic approximation of paradise made by humans on Earth. Using Voltaire's Candide, the work provides a rational way of looking at the image by dividing each one into multiple layers of information. How do we experience a flattened depiction if we get inside of a depiction? And what do we experience based on our particular movement? Be it linear, rotational, or approximating a core from any given point in a sphere. The main gallery could be viewed from two separate axes. First axis is parallel to the entrance, looking into the gallery from the outside and interacting with the objects placed in the glass vitrine. Three miniature worlds on pedestals are created, and each of them are located in three different regions of the gallery. They encapsulate the three most important locations portrayed in the novella by Voltaire. Westphalia, the first region, which you just looked at, represents Eden, which you just saw. El Dorado represents paradise, which you're looking at right now, and Constantinopolis is asymptotical approximation of paradise made by human owners. These three different locations showcase traveling of the main characters, of the protagonist, and coming of an age and realization of the world and the working of the world. Second axis is perpendicular to the entrance. One has to enter the gallery and turn left to walk through 5 sets of drawings depicted on 30 layers of tightly knit structured veil. These layered drawings take advantage of the notion of trace and residual information to act as a contingent mechanism through which radically disparate zones of experience are mediated and forced into unexpected dialogue with one another. The first set illustrates the logic behind translation of each of the fictitious region to physical objects and miniature worlds. It visually elaborates 3 representational techniques which have been twisted to help architecturalizing and bringing into being something fictitious which has a spatial potential. The second set illustrates the novella. It divides the main 3 regions based on 3 interpretations of gardens. It depicts and physically maps out the physical journey combined with character journey, and it involves the main characters, each moving outward and their story unraveling at different rates. The next 3 sets unpack each one of the techniques in relation to the world it represents. Through tracing, each layer of veil translates and transforms the information and establishes a spatial and architectural connection between Candid's fictitious world to the material world and the space of the gallery. These drawings use literature as a proxy to twist and invent representational techniques in favor of discovering modes of perceiving the existing space and inventing new modes of space-making techniques, in addition to using the grain of data as materiality information. There's a virtual version of Armstrong Gallery, Armstrong's Other, in perpetual simulation, which you can see projected on the physical Armstrong in this series of images. Out of the gallery and down to the main hallway, our spatial rhetorical apparatus for the time being, we can step inside the next exhibition space, the garden's annex. If one uses the staircase to access the annex exhibition, I noticed the video is not moving, but it's okay, you can see it online. If one uses the staircase to access the annex exhibition, the first thing they encounter are large flat screens showcasing Armstrong's Other, the simulation which is projected elsewhere and sometimes in the gallery itself. The grain of data in these simulations act as material information. The simulated virtually materialized twirl perpetually brings into being a particular experience of a space for a fleeting moment before updating the set and establishing a new experience. Rather than particularizing the simulated movement as a mean of replicating the real material things, each layer of information becomes a material on in itself, ontologically equivalent in terms of design. Stepping inside the main mezzanine space, one could see 7 frame drawings and a drawer. Note that there are 2 different modes of accessing this space. Using the staircase would land you in front of the digital screens, and using the mechanical mean, the elevator, would land you in front of the analog drawings. The annex holds the traditional frame drawings in which we see delaminated and layered in the main gallery to unpack the compact techniques and give one the opportunity to occupy the space of the frame drawings. You can see the compact version of the first and second set here, which is a translation of Condit to visual construct and translation of visualization to an occupiable spatial gallery space. The 7 frame drawings that are featured in the annex exhibitions are compiled version of translucent layered veils featured in Condit Guardians exhibition. Each featured frame drawing showcases a canonical geographical location in Voltaire's Condit, which holds significance in character development and contain the recurring motif of garden. In addition, each drawing analytically elaborates the representational technique which have been used to translate the work of literature to architecture and visually manifest fictitious architecture of the given realm. The drawer contains process drawings, further elaborating the representational techniques that are used in the project. In addition, participants could view multiple iterations of the veils installed in the gallery with various fabric materials and its structural integrity. By putting on cotton gloves and engaging with various archival entities featured in the drawers, participants are given an opportunity to engage with the exhibition in a more intimate scale. Walking away from the annex exhibition to the material library, one would see the Latent Compatibility exhibition. Latent Compatibility is another showcase running in parallel with Condit's Garden. Condit is a didactic unpacking of series of techniques which are scalable and malleable enough to be repurposed, reused, and adopted by others. While the main annex holds the traditional frame drawings that are delaminated and layers in the gallery, the second portion, Latent Compatibility exhibition, showcased depictions of the same canonical realms illustrated in Voltaire's Candide, illustrated by students during the eponymous seminar that I ran in the past springs. Each student, after reading Condit, have chosen one of the main 3 realms, Westphalia, El Dorado, and Constantinopolis, to represent and visualize it spatially using various techniques and methodologies that have been covered during the seminar. This is a sample work of a student showcasing Constantinopolis using the grain of data as materiality of the physical virtual depiction. Back to the main hallway, the rhetorical apparatus. After visiting both additions to Condit's Garden, it becomes apparent that those frame drawings and analog models inside of the gallery are meant to produce a structured veil installation in Armstrong Gallery. If the annex could be viewed as a traditional architecture exhibition, or rather, if we see traditional frame drawings featured in the annex as a typical exhibition, Condit's Garden in Armstrong Gallery on one hand, and Latent Compatibility on the other hand, are the moments where this construct shifts identity from a speculative work to a fully disciplinary project that is tangible, accessible, and malleable enough to be reused by other designers to generate meaningful conversations and establish discourse. With this cohesive collection of work, which takes various forms from 3D miniature worlds to occupiable shape-shifting drawings, the grain of data and layered information becomes a new materiality for the space of exhibitions. Motifs assume an abstracted form and objects lose their established meanings. The gallery space turns into a grounded space-time continuum to bring distant points in history in our immediate adjacency. This condition brings into being something from the past to our contemporary state of existence. Doing so turns the space of the exhibition into a proper in-between state where Condit's enlightenment reality and our post-critical stage tend to coexist. Okay, that's it for my talk.
Thank you so much, Zahra. Dana?
Okay, so our last fellow projecting his work will be Benjamin Vanmuysen. Welcome, Benjamin. Benjamin was 2019-2020 Harry Van Boghosian Fellow at Syracuse University, where he currently continues to teach. He's also founder of Cabinet BV. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Engineering and Architecture from the KU Leuven in Belgium, and a Master of Architecture from Princeton University. And he will be sharing his screen right now. Thanks, Benjamin.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you for the intro. Let me try to share my screen. All right, does everybody see my screen okay? Yes, awesome. So as the other speakers today, I'd like to thank the University of Virginia to host this event, and Kyle and Katie to bring us all together to talk about our work that we've been doing the past year or are still in the progress of completing. So as mentioned by Dana, I was the Harry Boghosian Fellow at Syracuse University, where I pursued my fellowship on design extremes, more specifically under and over design. Those two terms were interesting to me as they're part of our architectural jargon. Over design more so than under design. I found examples of architects who've written it in publications, but mostly it's definitely a term that has been used in, in the academic setting, but also in the private industry where I've been working. I've heard that term being used quite a lot, but nobody has really investigated or even tried to define these two terms. So that's what the fellowship aimed to do, is to investigate these two limits of the design spectrum and try to further investigate them and start a conversation about those two limits of the design spectrum. And maybe another important thing to mention is how the fellowship at Syracuse is structured. It's distributed over 2 semesters. In the fall semester, the Boghosian Fellow teaches a research seminar, and in the spring, a design seminar and a vertical critic studio. My research seminar investigated case studies in which students analyzed the projects through presentations and readings, but also through drawings. They dissected multiple projects into these respective design extremes. And we specialized primarily on deconstructivist projects, not only because of their geometric complexity, but also because of their intellectual baggage and philosophical convolutions that these projects have. This slide is an example of a student of mine who dissected the N5 folie of Bernard Tschumi. Another interesting parallel to these projects at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, is that, deconstruction or deconstructivism is already embedded by opposite binaries. So it was interesting to kind of analyze these projects again through a different twofold or different binary, in this case, under and over design. So the fall semester was a great time to reflect and, as I mentioned, analyze these two terminologies. But then in the spring, me, myself, and the students turned that that knowledge into doing. In other words, we put ourselves in the shoes of the under designer and over designer. So instead of categorizing existing work into these two categories, it was important, not only for me, but I think also for the students, to go through this process themselves. And the parameter to go through this process was basically time or design speed that was dedicated on parts of their studio project. So here are a collection of different examples of some of my students' work. They designed a fashion store in Rhinebeck, New York, of all places. And again, here, the fashion world has also a rich history between low and high design. If you think of Comme des Garçons or Maison Margiela, who have also been associated with deconstruction back in the 80s. So just to give you a brief overview of how the studio was set up and how their process directed their design, was that I handed them exercises and dedicated specific time slots for every step throughout the studio. So they started with designing a massing, which was a 4-hour exercise. Then they moved on to the interior, received much more time to further develop the interior of their stores. And then there were scalar leaps that moved to, for instance, elements and objects. And within their store, they didn't only design the exterior and the internal organization, but they also designed the elements and objects in their project. And the examples shown here are changing rooms, a shoe display, and clothes hangers. So besides the twofold in design speed, there was also a change in scale throughout their project. And well, you might think that extending and shortening your design process is quite counterintuitive and quite forced, but I believe that going through this process is instructive for students as they, after this exercise, can figure out their own middle ground or their own sweet spot between, the timeframes given, or between under and over design, which are these limits of the design spectrum that I previously mentioned. And then lastly, the design seminar was basically focused on the final production of the fellowship, which was the exhibition in the Marble Room, which is very recognizable room, which is extensive use of bookshelf marble slabs in the room, which is, I think Maya can probably agree with that. It's a hard space to work with. So in my design seminar, we basically again try to under and over design the space simultaneously and juxtapose those two outcomes next to one another, basically. So here is, just before I delve into the highlight of the fellowship, which was the installation, I just wanted to briefly describe how I see, how I would define under and over design. And maybe another important thing to mention is that the entire year, me and my students have ignored the biased good design or the in-between in the spectrum, if you will, if you look at this very sophisticated graph. So I really wanted to analyze that moment where the author has gone too far, included too unnecessary complexity through ornamentation or through intellectual convolution, if you will. And then under design is the opposite. It's not designed, it's just the very lazy solution, the easiest solution to solve a problem at its most in its most abstract notion. And also both these terms have negative connotations, right? So it's dealing with the double negative and ignoring the in-between or the middle, as I mentioned previously. So then moving to the actual installation in the Marble Room, in order to transform this room into, let's say, a a binary between high and low, or under and over, we decided to focus our attention on 5 elements through the space: the floor, the wall, the ceiling, the door, and the ductwork that you saw in the original image. So another important thing to know in this developed surface drawing is that the actual installation is this left area, or almost southern area of the room. And next to it, there's a little process room that shows some behind the scenes work behind the design process of the exhibition, just to quantify the time that we, again, dedicated to the binary between under and over design throughout the space. Here's a model that just elaborates on what I just said. The process, basically, this is the process room or the exhibition of the installation. So while, which I will explain in a minute, the surfaces reflect back on the marble room, and then the process room reflects back on the installation. So I just briefly want to say a couple words on each element or on each component of the exhibition. The primary focus was the floor, in which the floor is divided between a low effort and a very high intensity effort surface. So, you know, the under-designed floor are just arranged 4x8 plywood sheets, while the over-designed floor is more geometrically complex. It is crumbled. Every piece is custom, and on top of that, it's also manufactured out of a faux marble, again to respond to the authentic marble in the room. So DuPont Corian donated the majority of the sheets that you see in this image. And again, I think the extremes remain subjective after a year of research, but I would argue that this floor is highly designed because it's not even flat. There's only a restricted portion that is actually occupiable, and the floor, in other words, controls the movement of the visitor instead of the other way around, right? So it's basically high intensity versus flexibility, if you will. Here's just another detail of some of the corners. And the dichotomy between under and over design is approached slightly differently in the wall, where the overall wall becomes a framework for the anchorment of its actual structure, which is the cement bags. So again, in line with some of the other aesthetic preferences mentioned earlier today with the exposed stud wall, this wall was metal studs because it's fire rated, and it just follows the dimensions of the elements that it's used to construct it, right? So the studs are spaced equally to match the size of the drywall, and the bracing also again follows the manufactured holes in the studs, but then the over design component are these 80-pound bags. The time investment was dedicated on how this wall touches the ground. Here you can see a close-up of these custom designed cement bags that anchor this wall to the ground, but also divide the process room with the actual installation. And then I don't know if you saw in the previous image, but there was another component to the wall, which was this duct, which manifests itself to the connections. You know, the lazy solution is to just buy the Home Depot ductwork, the do-it-yourself, and then these two are custom 3D printed and highly ornamented connectors for no particular reason other than being didactic in the exhibit. And you can see an example of that here. And inside this transparent tube, it again displays multiple iteration of the design of that ductwork that we went through. And lastly, the ceiling surface. I think similarly to the previous slides, it's implementing a graphic on the ceiling, and more specifically a reflected ceiling plan that is actually installed on the ceiling. So again, using the ready-made that is then very carefully arranged on the ceiling according to convention and architectural rigor, if you will. And that's how that turned out. So basically the reflected ceiling on the ceiling. We even added some faux elements, for instance, the wire router, the socket, and smoke detector are fake, just to intensify the reflected ceiling plan. Here's some more images of that vinyl job came out. And the exhibition was also postponed due to COVID-19. So I wanted to end with this slide, is where I tried to explain the exhibition while being presently in the room without any slides. So I thought that was an interesting note to end on. So the opening, the gallery talk with Michael Speaks, was virtually held on Zoom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Van. Thank you for concluding the panel. So as you can tell from all of us mispronouncing each other's names, the extreme unfamiliarity with some of our work and way of thinking and way of working probably will permeate some of the discussion. So neither Maya nor I have a super choreographed moderating style. So perhaps I can start maybe kicking off or framing the discussion between Maya and I, and then we would like to open it up to the panel. And we would like to make it really kind of democratic, as everybody's on the screen. Your names are on the screen, so please do use chat or unmute yourself in the awkwardness of the Zoom moments, or raise your hand if there is a kind of a intensity of the conversation, and we will try to incorporate everybody's input and questions. In terms of the, thank you everybody for the presentation, the work and framing and kind of getting to know deeper precedents and thoughts behind your work has been really incredible. What I like to kind of shift the title from digital imaginaries maybe towards something that occurred to me during the presentations, which to me refers to magical realism. And really not to be confused with science fantasy. Magical realism, as most of you probably know, it's the style of fiction or literary genre that paints sort of realistic world of the modern world, but adds the sort of magical elements that reverse or pursue these sort of dialectics between sort of a convention and familiarity to or uses the kind of a fiction with proposed fiction and proposed new narratives that perhaps create this ideas for new strangeness or new imaginary through the different forms of digital intervention. And the reason why I thought of magical realism is also that the genre usually occurs within a time of crisis, or historically, if you think of from Milan Kundera to Borges to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, there is a sort of an escape from reality and construction a new fictitious magical world that we understand through using the patterns of convention and parts that are real and accessible to us, that we project our new kind of fictitious sense of empathy or imagination onto. And I think that this theme of dialectic of the two was really evident through everybody's work. Starting from Viola's kind of using the tension between defying and registering the forces, and referring to phenomenology of empathy, to Galo's idea of kind of a new forms of consciousness that emerge through understanding of a software that really give us the path towards a sort of a social project. And from Ben's kind of a dialectics of over under, Michael's fake and real, and Zahra's the kind of understanding of a miniature and magical projections with sort of association and dissociation between the two. And I think it maybe brings me back to something Viola was talking about and mentioned with readings of Jane Bennett. And this is and a construction of the empathy relative to kind of the world we're in and the crisis we're in currently. Sort of how does the kind of emergence of this form of practice relate to the kind of a new political body that this would engage? And Jane Bennett talks about sort of a political ecology and through the forms of, for the kind of actants, where the unfamiliar or the other or the otherness becomes sort of a part of our bigger consciousness. And I think that that's where the difference between the empathy and sympathy occurs. And empathy is kind of an emotional, and this is another dialectic, and empathy is sort of an emotional way of thinking or relating to, where sympathy is more kind of a construction of a consciousness, and one cannot occur within the other. So maybe starting the conversation with through the path of all of yours project, not specifically, and maybe this is a question for Maya first, and she can then direct it to the others, to how do you think about your particular project in a kind of a construction of the social practice that I believe you all relate to, relative through the sort of this construction of the magical fictiousness and narrative, and through your work a little bit more specifically. So how do you go beyond the pedagogy and research relative to the more specific series of effects?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I feel like my question that came to my mind goes kind of along those lines, but might be a little bit more specific to some of the end products. So, but maybe we can start with sort of the larger conversation in terms of what are the speculative aspects of real or magical when it comes to applications, to how we start to inject that back into the current situation, or once we emerge out of the current situation, how do we emerge out of it and start to apply that back into our architectural practices? Anyone wants to jump on that? Otherwise, I would have more specific questions.
I think to me, it seems like it's really almost like a question of accessibility, like meaning who is really the audience for some of these projects, right? I think that's maybe a question that should be asked, because I think Donna's question about point about magic is really, really interesting to me, and I would love to talk about magic all day, because magic basically the whole genre of magical realism is supposed to be super accessible, right? You're supposed to tell stories of the everyday, and then the everyday becomes somehow not so everyday through narrative and through a good story, right? And so the allegories within magical realism are the important part, right? And so maybe, we can just go through everyone and say, well, are you thinking allegorically? If you are, I mean, I know Zahra is sort of almost like exactly thinking allegorically, right? And I think there's something in that particular project that's really interesting, because the choice to use Candide as a piece of literature that is widespread, right? And a lot of like the odds that some people may have read Candide in high school are pretty high compared to like other more esoteric texts, right? And so I think it's important to maybe frame that discussion around audience. For me in particularly, I really have just become increasingly frustrated with a kind of pigeonhole of a workflow in the digital world, right? The idea that somehow when you're working in the digital, you have to develop your own privatized workflow and never share it with anyone else, or maybe you kind of patent it or you copyright it, and that becomes like your way of working, and even worse. Through kind of like corporate interests, right? Like the idea that you can hold on to a specific technology and never share it to anyone else. That's become increasingly frustrating for me in terms of just design working. And so that's really where my interest in sort of opening up the consciousness that we're all sort of familiar with, right? This idea of clicking buttons, working in 3D virtual space, getting on Zoom calls, opening that up as a way of working and a way of accessing a wider audience, and maybe that can allow for new imaginations or new imaginaries to sort of emerge as well. I think that's really what I'm trying to get at with this idea of the digital consciousness, because it is a public thing. It's a you know, we are all familiar with phones and all of that stuff. Like, how can we use those as mediums or as ways of telling stories?
But I think that there's an emergent, kind of a collective emergent aesthetic coming out of this way of thinking, which is exactly what you kind of started framing, Galo, relative to sort of accessibility and familiarity, right? So if you look at the kind of to create this idea of, Viola called it maybe new strangeness, right? There is sort of the object itself is familiar, it's banal, it's we can associate it to kind of the everyday kind of a social system that we're completely familiar with, right? It's not about a novelty of the object. It's kind of about almost like a collage of a found object that then you project the new imaginary on. And that's where the sort of attention to me or kind of familiarity, and that's where the magical realism starts to emerge as a sort of a part of the emergence of the particular language that comes out of this group that is sort of threaded through in a, you know, with the different specificities, but while it's really not about kind of finding solutions, it's really finding new ways to communicate ideas through sort of a almost low-tech materialities through using the kind of a high-tech software, right? So if you think of architecture as sort of a hardware and the kind of a thickness of the surface that is being the sort of almost like a digital scrapbook, which is projected on the green screen of architecture, right? The sort of, and I think Michael, you guys, you didn't show this project, but I think you have a project called, I forget what it's called, but it deals with this idea of a green screen, right? As well. So that kind of tension between, you know, what is fake, what is real, how does that affect our consciousness? How does change the sort of our perception of reality, and where does magic occur? And is really magic about sort of creating new forms of empathy that architecture can offer, which makes it more accessible? Is to me a theme that is has emerged through the series of these panels. Michael,
yeah,
you
maybe.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Maya. No, sorry.
No. Yeah, I was going to say, Michael, if you want to jump in.
I'll respond. You know, I think one thing that kind of comes up about the familiar being disturbed, maybe is one way I would also think about it, is that it's sort of, at least in my project, it was sort of about establishing a control that's like recognizable. The stud frame wall is something that's readily accessible and then is challenged in some sense, or is put into a context where it forces its hand to behave in a new way. And I think the magical part of that, if I like that term, the magical realism of this, is that it's operating at a level that causes to reconsider how the wall is framed in general, and meaning that it operates at perhaps larger levels in the discipline or epistemologically, where if we use kind of like controls, I think Viola, like the probably like volumes, like primitive volumes falling into place, then are like registered as a control to see how the physics of the environment then disturb them. Once we understand how those things are disturbed, then it kind of upsets our thinking about how things might be stacked, framed, put into place in the discipline in general. So I think for me, these projects across the board are starting to challenge, I guess, like the norms that we inhabit, and that seems to me maybe something generationally that we're all kind of interested in, as a way to reshape and question, in my case, Durand, or like really like 18th century Enlightenment architecture that is questionable, highly questionable in some ways. Using that as a mechanism, and also using stud framing then as a kind of like a foil to register different things, to then upset or propose that there could be other ways of thinking about things in general. So in these cases, I think the digital is a mechanism or a medium by which that starts to occur, where the disturbance is registered or put through, and then we start to understand not them as norms that we inhabit. Like in Galo's case, I think that these softwares have become habitualized in a certain way, but if we start to unpack and recode them, then we start to realize that like Viola's reference to the matrix, that there's a kind of like other way of looking at all of things, including the discipline of architecture, and how that might be registered to different types of effects or different ways of thinking.
This might be the low-hanging fruit question that I mean, or a version of that. I'll try to disguise it now that I made sure that that's still the low-hanging fruit question. That I usually like to ask, especially when people did not apply to be on a panel, but they were put on a panel. Just in terms of how maybe you start to see yourself through the lens of the group. The way I see it, or the way I'm curious to hear really from each of you is has something to do with what Dana was talking about or mentioned in the beginning, and really also elaborated further in her initial question. It has something to do with that something that is initially clear or subjective or real or normative isn't, right? It's and then to me, all of your projects kind of start to challenge that in their own way. They start to challenge something that should be just a number or a code that if one is not familiar with softwares or code might understand as something that is just that. There's no bias to it. It's just numbers, but it isn't, right? So the understanding of, and there were in all of your presentations some words like reality, or when it comes to real materials, or the physical, or the natural. Viola, you were talking about defying natural, or what you were talking about in terms of alt form. So the kind of play between what maybe the original canon understood as singular reality towards something that is more about the multiplication of realities or the layering of realities. And then maybe specifically what I'm interested in is how each of you are starting to think about that in terms of materials, like architectural materials, and how to start to challenge that through that. I don't know, maybe someone who hasn't talked yet. Ben, do you want to? I like that he gave me a nod about the marble room, because I mean, ultimately it's the worst room to exhibit anything, and it becomes it always becomes a project about materials and site, just because one gets pushed into that room.
Yeah, I'll speak to that. That marble room is definitely challenging, and it did induce a project that relied heavily on material and on the fake, right? I think that's my primary parallel with the other fellows that present their work today, is the translation between digital and physical. And obviously, even though I try to aim for a certain complexity with certain surfaces, my knowledge is not at the level of some of the coding or software engineering that was mentioned today. But I think I see this trend appear through multiple contemporary practitioners' work, is this interest in the faux or the non-real. So yeah, that, I don't know, that doesn't really answer your question, but I think that's maybe how it ties us all together.
Mm-hmm.
Zahra, you're unmuted. Yeah, there you go. Looks like your mouth is moving, but no sound was coming out.
Talk, not talk. I wasn't really talking. It was just mouth open. Maya, I think that's a really good reading and a good way of connecting our projects to one another, gathered under the umbrella of digital imaginary. Sure, but I think some of them are very, very different from one another. But we have this whole, from the discourse of 18th century Enlightenment, or rather criticizing, if you notice, I was reading Adorno, criticizing 18th century Enlightenment, to working with the stud wall and working with robotics, but the notion of materiality, or rather the new translation of materiality, information materiality. I don't like to say immaterial material because that's false nomenclature, but I think that's a very correct reading of, maybe that is the thing that connects all of our works to one another. There are notions of obsession with the realness or lack thereof, but I find it a little bit irrelevant to what we're trying to do, especially right now. In the past few years, there's not much definition, or there's a lot of definition, and there's a lot of debate of what is real, what is not real. And I think the definition of realness in a philosophical term, in the discourse, or even in the disciplinary term, or even in practice, is something that is heavily malleable. So tackling the notion of materiality as something that is the new definition of the real, as something that is malleable, that could be something, but also something else, and could be something today, but simulate itself to become something tomorrow, is probably one of the facets that brings us together. It's probably one of the spheres that a project about physics and physics simulation and a 18th century literature and stud walls or over design, under design can all gather together and operate in a disciplinary manner and be able to have discursive conversations.
I think it's also maybe I see a parallel thread here between everyone, and maybe just a kind of generational thread as well, that tackles this idea of easiness and the easiness versus difficulty, maybe, because it seems like maybe some of these projects, at least me, I've been sort of struggling with how easy things are in the digital world, right? So the digital exists because, you know, of this thing called user friendliness, and things are supposed to be more easy. Automation is supposed to become easier. You know, making things are supposed to be easier. But then we as architects, we like to make things difficult, right? We like to explore difficult things, right? We like to explore reality, the difficulty of reality, the difficulty of existence, right? And so in a way, we're like sort of, I don't know, I'm sort of struggling with like, how do I keep things easy, but also explore the difficulty inside of those easy things? And so, for example, Viola, maybe you can address your project a little bit, but like I think it's really, really interesting that the physics simulations have become easier and easier and easier to do. But and so because they've become easier, then all of a sudden you can tackle the more difficult sort of attendant issues that come with them, right? Michael, maybe also like machine learning is easier and easier and easier to do. I saw you, I think a screenshot from Runway ML, right? And that's basically a kind of user-friendly machine learning interface, right? And so it's no longer behind a gate, right? These types of knowledges that are that were basically off limits for a previous generation. And so while on the one hand they're sort of easy, we're always looking for the difficult project to do within it, right? And I don't know, I think that's also maybe a thread that's worth talking about.
But I think that the easy and difficult is not just relative to the skill, but it's also relative to the kind of a cultural significance of the bigger project of architecture relative to the era we're in. And and I think relative to Zahra's comment on kind of the realities are relevant or reality, that not looking for the realness, not realness, is, I mean, those kind of moments of, and this is where the magical realism has some form of analogy as a genre, as a kind of a collective aesthetic language that emerges from within the discipline, is the kind of that the reality has been, as a collective reality, has been completely kind of disinherited, and this has a kind of a current political connotation. I think that these kind of questions of finding new realities come within a times of oppression or a time of crises. And so if you look at the sort of a history of literally magical realism, from kind of totalitarian systems to other authoritarian systems, the kind of emergence of a completely other narrative, in a way that, and we're seeing it right now, right? So, but we're essentially using the same tools, and we're using very self-similar tools, and just like the idea of kind of the fake real that produces completely new reality, and we'll live in these alternative realities, is also something that architecture participates in. There is a kind of a complicitness relative to the issues of ethics and construction of public and accessibility of this kind of genre relative to what kind of environments it produces and how easy they are to access and how easy we can project these new realities onto them. So this was perhaps embedded in the first question or first framing of the opening. I was trying to pose to all of you is that, where is this going and how do you see your work in that context?
I mean, I'll try to make my way into the kind of three sets of questions I see on the table, which are like, just to kind of recap, I guess what I think they are is Galo's question about easiness, Maya's question about the real, and then Donna, you're kind of leaning into like the political of our projects or where they might lie politically. And I think, Galo, you're correct. I used Runway ML, and it kind of like that plugin or that feature arrived just by circumstance midway through the project and kind of like opened up certain doors. And I'm not inherently like a good coder. And so I think that that's, that makes the digital imaginary as a kind of topic is kind of interesting to me, because like my way into machine learning is really about interrogating the images that arrive out of it through an architectural lens. So applying the kind of architectural skills that I have growing up as an architect, as a student, without coding as a kind of forefront. So I think like all of us are in a generation too, where it's like we're not being taught these skills, we're picking them up on our own. So like the way that we interrogate those tools is always about those attendant issues, I guess is my point, is that we're kind of like picking up those kind of new features with ease and always focused around other kind of questions that hover with them. And I think that kind of gets into the kind of question of the real that Maya is bringing up here, which means that I think we can effectively slide between things that are physical and things that are like digital with kind of ease in a way that becomes a murky territory. So I think in the project that I created, certainly in the project, Donna, that you referenced, Prom Picture is the name of that one, the chroma key one, and there's actually a fellowship project, but my partner's fellowship project. the final thing as built is sometimes the real thing, let's say like the final output, but sometimes the image of the thing is the real, meaning that it's not yet complete until the physical thing has had a photo taken of it, then it's chroma keyed on. So there's a kind of like a confusion between like when the project stops, with what ease does the project stop, how do we apply certain techniques with ease that then confuse certain boundaries, create that kind of like magical realism I think that we're getting into. And then the sort of like political of that is that I think that that kind of murky territory of where the real ends and where the physical begins starts to construct different narratives about how we inhabit space, or in a chroma keyed set, that the final image of the thing is more real than your experience of the space of the thing. Meaning in our Zoom backgrounds, none of us are actually have these kind of projecting fellows backgrounds in our rooms that we're sitting in. I think, I hope. But this is the kind of real that we're actually inhabiting now. And so I think that there's a kind of confusion that we're slipping between these boundaries continuously. And the architectures that we're producing are continuously frustrated by that, inhabiting that, dealing with attendant issues of that. And of course that there's sort of politics embedded within these kind of things, like, you know, with machine learning too, like the biases inhabited in the machine construct real worlds, but they're built on fallacies, the algorithms themselves. So I think that there are certain things that we're unpacking, the way we question code, the way we inhabit the images that come out of machine learning in that instance, are really about questioning the kind of politics that are embedded within the algorithm themselves and how they might be rethought, unpacked, visualized, and unblack boxed so that we can kind of inhabit a new world.
Thank you for that answer, Michael. This is actually my real wallpaper. I was so inspired by this. So, and you cannot prove to me that I wasn't. So, which brings another kind of a theme, which has to do with irony, or the kind of a new magical theme that I think a lot of your project also refer to. But before going into the territory, I was also wondering if we have any questions from the audience. I think we're kind of slowly stepping towards the end of the session, and we got a little bit self-centered here. So I would like to make sure that we open it up, or we can just talk.
Or we can just keep talking. If anyone wants to throw something in the chat for us, we're happy to relay that or call on you. But yeah, as Dana was just saying, we're more or less at our cutoff time. Is that true, Katie, Kyle?
Yeah, we can continue for a couple more minutes if it's okay with all of you. The presentations ran a little bit longer, but we're all really rich. So if you want to continue the conversation for a couple of minutes, I think that would be great.
Or if there are questions from the audience, and that's great too.
Maybe while you're thinking,
yeah,
answer Galo's question as well about the notion of difficulty, but also connect it back to the first point you brought up about the accessibility. Maybe I can only talk about from my point of view, but I think the difficult project now in terms of delving in the realm of digital imaginary, whatever that may be, is a question of accessibility. Yes, learning the softwares is becoming easier. Communication is becoming easier. I can't talk much about the technical digital stuff or coding or machine learning. I think I stopped learning softwares 7 years ago, but it's the question of learning how to communicate with the people, with the scientists, how to talk about 18th century, how to talk about Candide and literature to a physicist and tell them, what do you want exactly to be simulated? And then talk about the physical simulation that somebody with absolute no understanding or lack of spatial understanding, how to explain it back to the discipline of architecture and then make that discursive. So for me, the difficulty is operating in many different spheres, acting as a true architect who knows many little things about, but nothing really deep, and be able to connect somebody with a physics background, a scientist, to a person who studies literary criticism and establishes those conversations and build something at the end that is accessible toward the public at large, which I think I really appreciate, Galo, you brought it up, and I think that's a frustration with all of us, the notion of our discipline maybe becoming too hermetically sealed, or maybe we're past that. I like to think we're past that. All of us are thinking about accessibility, but being obsessed with one's workflow, or being obsessed with the technique as opposed to the ramifications of it for the society, or the implications of it toward the public at large. For me, that's a difficult project. How to, yes, invent the techniques, yes, how to talk discursively, perhaps in a symposium setting, and talk architecture with architects, but also be able to have the same projects and translate it to somebody who studies literature, and have a literary conversation with them, or have the same project and talk about the physical simulations of it, and in a way eminent different cultural aspects, and as deep as it may, for lack of a better word, it sounds kind of cheesy, but bring people together under the umbrella that is, I don't want to say that is architecture, but that is maybe ethnographic, new anthropological branch of architecture that is kind of measuring up to its actual potential of being able to operate discursively, but also very, very technically, and always stay disciplined.
Video games do that already to some degree. And, you know, I have kids, so this kind of a ubiquity of understanding a certain processes is already cognitively embedded in the next generation. So some of these kind of dialectics that I think your generation has been facing, I think are definitely blurring through some of these new forms of digital platforms that produce understanding and accessibility to things we sort of went to or learn about or invented during our lifetime. There's a question from Tucker. I don't know if he wants to, I don't see him on my screen, so I'm just going to read it unless he wants to unmute himself and ask himself. Tucker? No, so I'm gonna read it. It's a good question, and I think that maybe that's something we can have as a kind of a final wrapping up of a conversation. Mm-hmm. In your opinion, he's unable to join audio. He apologizes, so I'll be his voice. In your opinion, what cultural work does contemporary fellowship do? It is an instigator that wraps up with or against the practice. Does it provide a backbone for the discipline? It is necessary, a few degrees removed, no tenure, short duration from the university itself to provide potential pollination. And I think, Galo, you actually opened up with a really great slide. I was really taken by that, because the idea of kind of how the fellowship is positioned relative to academia is super interesting one. And I think this goes to Katie and Kyle too, to kind of put this platform together to start rethinking about the kind of a larger effect of these kind of individual initiatives within different institutions that might have actually a collective effect. So I think you can see the question in a chat if I read it too fast or confused it.
Personally, I mean, yeah, I feel compelled to put up that transparency slide. Well, mostly because that information is already public, right? It's Ohio State is a public institution, and so it would be maybe a little bit unfair to speak about information that's not public. But in my personal opinion, I would just say yes. I think the fellowships are necessary because they do provide this alternative model of academic research, right? There is, I think, at least in the ones that I've been in 2 fellowships, and none of them have required service, which is a really big relief if you know anything about academic positions. So you don't have to be involved with those kind of mechanisms, and so it does liberate you to do work that would otherwise not be easy to do. And so I think that they are productive in that sense. That being said, there are also drawbacks to fellowships, like, for example, the fact that you have to uproot your entire life to actually go to a place. Maybe that's going to change a little bit with the proof that we can work virtually. But as of right now, all fellowships that I know of require you to move there, essentially, and that is also something that not everyone is able to do. So that is a kind of gatekeeping maneuver as well. And it privileges those that can move to certain places, work within the salary that they're offered, et cetera, et cetera. So there are pros and cons to all of that. My personal opinion is that all of that should be on the table when schools are offering these fellowships, right? Just put it all out there. I'm all for transparency.
Michael, Ben?
Maybe I'll choose to answer the first part of the question, just really because Galo, I think, succinctly answered the second part, which I agree with, so it won't be redundant. But I wanted to answer the first part really through how Katie and Kyle have put forth this symposium, which I think that the way that they initially wrote to us as fellows, sorry if I'm putting words in your mouths, but was that there's a kind of like Venn diagram between what the interests of a generation of emerging academics are and what the overlap is with the institutions. So in other words, if you're too radical, you don't get hired potentially. And if you're, if you don't intersect with the interests of the institution, then there's not like a common ground to speak. I think that there's like always in these fellowships, some sort of inclination towards spicing things up, for better words, for lack of a better word. But I think more so from the standpoint that I think that they're taking a risk on hiring someone with the knowledge that maybe their pedagogical aims are outside the bounds of like what they would typically be interested in, but they're willing to take that kind of risk. And in other words, I think that the Venn diagram is about expanding the bubble of interest beyond what is known by an institution, so that the institutions are testing ideas, allowing for different ideas that are kind of percolating but not yet grounded, to really start to gain a foothold in the institutions, in the discipline, not just the institution. So I think that there is a kind of an interesting moment where those things kind of align between the institution's interests and the fellow's interests. And that's something that I see as super positive, is that I think that there probably is like more leakage of ideas into the schools because of that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to add on to that, I mean, I agree with how interesting the question is, how interesting is what Katie and Kyle are putting on the table screen for us, and really also all the answers. Viola's answer included, because I obviously understand that. I also think that's why creating a conversation that we're having this week or the next couple of weeks is so important, right? To actually pull it out of that shaking up mentality that Michael, you were talking about, which I also completely agree, that is more of an institution kind of approach to a fellowship, and starting to think about this as creating critical mass among a generation, because yeah, we are all especially right now dealing with the new kind of time era that will I mean, Dana was trying to get everyone out of their comfort zone and actually talk about that the world is on fire around us and how our projects start to change or engage with that. But that can probably only happen if we start to talk to one another and create a sort of conversation among one another with the projects that we're creating through the platforms that are provided to us, which I think is why, yeah, as I said in the beginning, I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, because I think it's important that we're all, despite our various degrees of lockdowns, continue to connect with one another in that way, and through that maybe also challenge some of the institutional problems that are embedded in certain aspects of positions like this.
I do think that that's really thoughtful framing, Maya. I also think it does build a little bit of an institutional empathy towards having fellows and having the kind of a short-term way of sort of infiltrating the system, which has a degree of rigidity, as you all know, does create a response, and that response goes from rejection to sympathy to empathy to kind of dissociation, obviously, but there is a kind of I think the practice of fellowship, I think it's really critical to moving the institution forward. And I think that perhaps, I hope that there is a sort of a co-benefit between both the institutions and the fellows on that's the idea, but sometimes the balance might not be truly balanced. And the transformation of the institution is definitely much slower than some of the ideas that are being put forward. But on that note, maybe we're 15 minutes over, and Kyle and Katie, if there are no further questions from the audience, maybe we can kind of wrap up the panel and thank everybody for their presentation. Thank you for participation. Thank you for having us all here and spending this Tuesday evening with us. And maybe Katie and Kyle, if you would like to close the panel, that would be great.
Well, thank you so much to all our fellow presenters and our moderators. I think this was a really productive discussion, and I think it was great to hear from kind of some of the individual projects across like what it means to be grouped by us into the digital imaginary, which I think you kind of grappled with quite eloquently. And then maybe some of the larger kind of ideas that come along with the kind of collectivity of the fellowship. So we're really grateful for that. And we just want to say thank you to everyone for joining, and look forward to next week where we have, I guess, the names listed above me, presenting next week on the 12th. And we have, I guess, behind me, our two moderators, Brandon Clifford and Alvin Huang. So we're really grateful to everyone involved, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good to see everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.